Before we get into the paper, I want to acknowledge 1199 again for hosting this, and also my co-writer, John Treat, who works really hard for the project. And we should also, because it always gets left at the end when everybody's tired, thank Irene Shen for getting us all in the room. It's a phenomenal amount of work to get us all here ready for this discussion. Knowing Irene, she's probably out of the room now taking care of something. So yeah, we'll let her know we thanked her. Okay, great. So this session, as the title of the presentation suggests, it's Broadening the Just Transition Debate, the Search for a Transformative Politics. I'm going to touch on some of the main points of the paper, but I can't deal with it all. And I'll explain why we wrote the paper, why we felt it was necessary, and it should become obvious as the presentation goes on. So I'm going to speak for hopefully 15, 20 minutes, and then we got some respondents who will introduce in due course. But I'm looking forward to another great session. Hopefully it'll go well. So as it's been pointed out, just transition was once exclusively a trade union demand, and it wasn't developed around climate change. It was developed by the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and the communication, energy, and paper workers in Canada around what workers who were facing disarmament. There was disarmament talks around the SALT negotiations back in the early 70s. There was an anti-nuclear movement in the US. And so unions like the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, under the leadership of Anthony Mazzocchi, now deceased, took a view that workers should not be put in a position of supporting work that was detrimental to the health and survival of the human species, but they needed to make a living. So there needed to be policies put in place called just transition. This has now been picked up by the global trade union movement, who after a decade of really tenacious lobbying got the just transition language into the preface of the Paris Agreement. We'll come back to that in a moment. Also, the International Labour Organization's guidelines for just transition and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Many of these conversations don't mean a lot to unions in the room, but they are kind of big deal in terms of the multilateral processes and the global discourse. Now, but why do we need to broaden the debate then? If it's in the agreement, isn't it a done deal? Probably not. So what we've seen, and the reason why John and I and TUED wrote the paper, is that different perspectives are emerging. It means different things to different people, just transition, both within the trade union movement and also with other movements also now taking up the just transition demand. Now, in the Paris Agreement, significantly, it says in the preface, we take into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce. So the word "of" there is significant because it's a transition that you will be, the workforce, transitioned. And there's not much language, not much of an inference there that workers will be involved in that transition and shaping it. Union approaches, as we analyze in the paper, take really three forms. They started off per the oil, chemical, and atomic workers' approach of protecting, a safety net approach to workers who are in the fossil fuel sector and carbon-intensive industries. What would happen to them if there was a robust approach to climate protection and a reduction of emissions? So unions went into that debate with that approach. But then, around about a decade ago, there was lots of research coming out. I personally was involved in one of the major studies with the United Nations Environment Programme, talking to the amount of work that could be created in reaching climate targets and greening the economy. So protection plus looking forward to job creation. We remember the Obama and the Hillary campaign in 2007 when they were running. They were talking about 5 million green jobs in America. And that was the language of the campaign here in the United States. But there's a third perspective that's emerging in the labor movement that looks actually at what actually needs to be transitioned from a point of view of economy and culture and so on. And we'll return to that important third dimension a little later. Now, Others are going to speak to this later in the day on the situation in Australia and Canada and elsewhere. But you can see Just Transition making the news. Here's the, we've got Lance McCallum from the Australian Council of Trade Unions here, so I won't speak about this particular case of Port Augusta. We also got now the Task Force on Just Transition for coal workers that Donald LaFleur will probably address, and what the significance of that. But other movements, in this case, the Asia-Pacific, APEN, I've forgotten the last two, Environment Network, saying, well, this is an opportunity to correct the racial, ethnic, racial inequalities, economic inequalities that run through the current model of energy and the current political economy. So we see Just Transition as an opportunity to reclaim control, particularly in the case of energy at the local level where we can produce electricity in the local space. Now, one of the reasons, again, one of the main reasons that we tried to write the paper and this has been since TUED started, we felt that the idea that the transition to a low-carbon economy was inevitable needed to be confronted. This is a language that a lot of the NGOs have picked up on, a lot of the renewable energy companies have picked up on, and a lot of political leaders saying it's inevitable because the science says it must happen, therefore it will happen. And we've been trying to show over the last 5 years that that emphatically is not the case. So we have, this is the former Director General of the UN. We have entered a new era. The progression to a low-emission, climate-resilient growth is inevitable, beneficial, and already underway. We could have an all-day PowerPoint pointing to examples of this approach that it's inevitable. Now, even if we look at the Paris Agreement, we can see that that is not true. The Paris Agreement, you can see the red line there. These are the pledges made by countries on emissions. And what do we see? We see emissions continuing to rise. This is based on if all the commitments in the Paris Agreement were met in full. And we already know we have a certain president who doesn't even want to participate in the Paris Agreement any longer. So even with full implementation of those commitments, every country has made a commitment on emissions. That is going to still continue to increase the emissions. If it wasn't for the agreement, it needs to be said, the emissions would go up even more steeply. And emissions levels continue to rise on a global level. And this is where the opposite direction we need to be going to keep temperatures within well below 2 degrees, if not 1.5 degrees. So this science is important because if we can comprehend the implications of the science, then we can shape our politics and our program accordingly. Without that comprehension, we are at sea, floating around without a clear view where to go. So here's, many of you have seen this. This is the sort of temperature spiral. It's only a minute or 40 seconds or so. You can see these are warming, how the Earth is warming. You can see the inner ring is 1.5 degrees, and the outer ring, the danger zone, is 2 degrees. And you can see the last part of that spiral, it's accelerating towards 1.5. So in maybe a decade or so, we could be way past that threshold. Now, one of the concerns that I think we should all have as trade unionists is the narrative around the just transition that has been the dominant narrative in the trade union movement internationally. This is a picture of the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Why are we showing this picture? During that period of history, it was recognized by the newly emerging European Common Market, it was called then the European Union, that workers' organizations, unions, were a legitimate social partner with employers and governments on equal terms, that any decision about this new community of nations should involve unions at the table in what was called social partnership through processes of social dialogue. This is where the term comes from. It's worth, of course, noting that this was a time when, during the Cold War, Europe was trying to position itself against strong left unions and movements, both inside Europe, but also internationally. And also there was an economic expansion where the US was leading and Europe benefited from. So there was a completely different situation. And unions who had emerged from the World War II period in the 1930s with strength, with confidence, organizing members, both in Europe and internationally. It was a time of when the movement was in the ascendancy. Now, this social dialogue and social partnership has become an almost exclusive narrative of unions around the world. It's a narrative that you'll hear in every corner of the world. Those of us who do international work with unions will hear it. And that's extremely significant. What the paper documents in some detail, and I don't have time to go into, is that social dialogue is largely dead in Europe, where it was born. These figures here on the left is bargaining coverage. You can see Europe is the top line, Western Europe. The little line here is Central and Eastern Europe. You can see bargaining coverage on the left going down, and the global mean is the dark line in the middle there. So you can see, yes, global density of bargaining is falling globally. It's falling less fast in Europe, but it's still falling nonetheless. More concerning is union density itself, because in parts of Europe you can be covered by a collective bargaining agreement, but you're not in a union. Here we see union density also falling in Europe. But this really doesn't really tell the whole story, because what happened during the neoliberal period in Europe, first the Maastricht Agreement, then the Lisbon strategy or Lisbon Treaty, opened up the logic of the market into politics and slowly but surely dismantled the power that unions had built up at the political level and at the workplace level. We also see in Europe centrifugal, that's my pronunciation because I'm from England, forces, that you see Europe itself is in jeopardy of breaking up. In this case, this is the Greek movement of 2015 against the Troika in that part of the world. But you can see it, and it was mentioned this morning with Zwelna Zimbabwe and others talking about the rise of the right in Europe and elsewhere. So what to do? Unions, I think, believing they're in a position, doing the best they can. Let's put it as clearly as that. Trying to make the best of a bad situation, saw the climate debate and the need to have a complete transition of economy as an opportunity to reboot social dialogue, even though it was no longer really happening in practice on any of the major decisions affecting Europe. So you'll see it's also part of, don't want to over-intellectualize this, but the sort of Keynesian debates about growth and the importance of economic growth. Keynesians always wanted growth. They felt that if you stimulate the economy and generate growth, you generate demand and you generate jobs. So it was very convenient to stick green in the front of growth, and you'll end up with supposedly some kind of green version of that. And not only is that paradigm not succeeding, it's actually politically in terrible state right now. So the climate issue became an opportunity to reboot, if you like, social dialogue and social partnership. Now, inside the trade unions, and this is at the European level, it's also acknowledged that the changes that are needed are radical and revolutionary in terms of their implications. Here's a quote. And actually, this is kind of amusing to this point. A low-carbon world is within our reach, but will require universal sectoral and economic transformations on a scale and at a speed faster than any in human history. Undoubtedly, the decarbonization process will have some disruptive effects. I mean, this is, in many ways, the understatement that creeps into our narratives at the trade union level, that we don't confront head-on the need in the social dialogue framing for the existing ownership and control of major industrial sectors like energy, but also others, to once again be part of the trade union discussion. social dialogue, as defined in this debate, has no room for challenging capital's right to control strategic sectors of the economy. And as long as we're not prepared to play that role or to assert that, it's not social dialogue. It's a dialogue on the terms of the employers and the governments who share their perspectives, that the market, liberalization, privatization will continue. And in the power sector, it's continuing now in Europe with the energy package, and it's also being promoted all over the world today, that the way to address the climate crisis is to sell off public utilities, let independent power producers representing private renewable energy companies come into the game. Subsidize those industries so that they're guaranteed revenues and profits at the public expense. And at the end of the day, build up a private industry to reward investors with our money, and then we end up not owning or controlling that sector. That's the fundamental politics that we are dealing with in the trade union movement today. We cannot accept this as a done deal, and resistance to that is growing. Now, a couple more quick points on this. Part of the strategy at the global level is to get closer to leading corporations. You even now find, this is Sharon Burrow, the head of the ITUC, saying, again, an industrial transformation of a scale we've never seen before. So the scale of what needs to be done is not an issue. The question is how. We've also got, this is the CEO of Unilever, part of this group called the B Team, which is a group of investors and CEOs of multinationals and one or two NGOs and unions, that they're calling for a just transition. So we see just transition, which came out of the labour movement, is now part of the discourse of a broader liberal corporate community. There's this guy, very much the climate hero among some people. There has to be a green energy revolution. And
well, hello, Virgin America. I happen to be in Los Angeles this week for our annual Rock the Casbah charity event, and I thought it was a good time to share my thoughts with all of you on the recent union effort at Virgin America. You've come out with an airline unlike any other. And now, I believe, the TWU is trying to take that uniqueness away. As you may recall, this is the very same lot that was first in line to join one of your competitors in calling for Virgin America to be grounded forever, just 2 years ago. And I believe that if they are allowed to succeed in their current efforts, the TWU would forever change what sets your airline apart in America. I am so proud of what you have built here, and I, along with many, many travellers who are cheering for this team, look forward to the day when you fly to 40 cities. So what I'd ask is, please get informed about what is at stake with this election, and understand that every single one of your votes do matter. I hope you believe in the Virgin America difference as much as I do, and vote to protect your independent spirit. And I urge you to say no to the old way of flying, and to say no to the TWU. Anyway, thanks for your time, and I hope to see you on a flight sometime soon. See you up there.
Now, obviously, this is a climate hero with relations now with union leaders who has helped frame the debate. And this is something I've been writing about in New Labour Forum, that great journal, which you should all subscribe to, about how the idea of a green economy and reducing emissions will unleash a new period of entrepreneurial energy and capitalist creativity and innovation. But he clearly doesn't want any unions part of that. So the point being here, there is a struggle going on around just transition that is at the highest levels, if you like, that we need to be aware of and to counter. Now, in the few minutes I have left, we've articulated in the paper what we call a social power approach. I hasten to add that this is a label for convenience for now, just to give us something to talk about. It's not supposed to be We're not patenting it anytime soon for profit. But we saw in the Rio Plus 20 talks, and some of us were in the room in Rio de Janeiro, when the green economy discussion was being put forward to the trade unions as being inevitable, it's going to create millions of jobs, all you need to do is just hang in there and be patient. That got a very, very serious opposition from unions in the room, particularly from unions from the global south. We also saw, Zweli will remember this, NUMSA in February 2012 in Johannesburg held out what I thought was a very important conference on the need for social ownership of renewable energy that was attended by many trade unions. And that inspired certainly myself and others working around Trade Unions for Energy Democracy and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung here in New York to organize Trade Unions for Energy Democracy in a meeting we had in Manhattan in October 2012, 2 weeks before Hurricane Sandy hit the region and knocked out everything for a while and killed 41 people on the same day. And we, along the lines of what Zweli was saying earlier this morning, we felt it was absolutely necessary not just to resort to slogans, that energy is crucial to stabilizing the climate. It's crucial to a decent life. 1.3 billion people don't have access to electricity. So we felt that the struggle for energy was central to the struggle against climate change. But it would also take on other very, very important issues about equality, about development, about human rights. I don't have time to go into what the resist, reclaim, restructure is, but I will focus on the reclaim, which is one of the jobs we have to do in the movement. And I'm sure there are people here who agree, like PSI and others, that it's no longer about resisting privatization. We have to reclaim strategic sectors of the economy, particularly energy, transport, and others, to full public ownership and democratic control. We're not alone in that. This is documents from, we have Transnational Institute here, Daniel Chavez, Just Transition, Reclaiming Public Services. And he's documented, or the TNI has documented, where this is happening on a global scale, of where public services are being taken back. This is the Public and Commercial Services Union, who will speak on this panel, Sam Mason, produced Just Transition and Energy Democracy. Getting away from a safety net protective view to a bigger, broader social transition, a social ecological transition. In the paper, we document our pro-public narrative is beginning to cohere. It's taken several years. The situation in Britain, I won't go into it now because it will come up, with the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party committed to reclaim the power sector and the postal service and the railway service and one or two other services to full public ownership in the event that the Labour Party is elected in the next election. TUED is organising there. We've got a meeting with the Shadow Minister, Rebecca Long-Bailey, a month from now in Sheffield, where we're talking about if and when the Labour Party is elected to government, how do we implement reclaiming the power sector to public control? How do we give workers a real voice in that? There are debates going on what that will mean and what it will entail, but it's definitely moving forward. The question of the South African Federation of Trade Unions came up. That quote was read out by Paula. I won't repeat it. But NUMSA, SAFTU, by saying that we can defend jobs in coal now because not defending them would be erode the social base for just transition in a heartbeat. But we don't leave it there. We defend those jobs in favor of a planned transition of energy over 2-3 decades, but also with public ownership and social ownership of renewables at the heart of that vision for energy transition in South Africa. In the US, and I'll conclude on these few slides, we've seen, Paula alluded to it this morning, the labor movement is divided on the Trump agenda. Some unions, at least the day after the inauguration of Trump, went into the White House and came out and said this was a great day for the American worker. Why? Because the United States is now the world's leading exporter of petroleum products. That's gas and oil combined. more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia. It's been on an upward curve now because of fracking, largely, has developed a surplus in shale gas and shale oil that they're trying to sell to the world, to countries that are energy starved, that need energy. And this is the strategy for economic development of the Trump administration, such as it is. The alternative, we see the NGOs talking for raising the issue of 100% renewable power. It couldn't be further away from the Trump agenda. But, and this is where I think TUED and the trade union movement can play a role, is we have to put on the table with the NGOs, our friends, that we cannot leave this to market forces. That if we don't reclaim control over the power sector, we will not be able to reach this target. It's as simple as that. Here's an illustration. This is US 9.9% renewables. That's total energy supply, and that includes hydroelectric power. So we're talking about a long way to go if you want to get to 100% renewable energy. And you know, in the Bernie Sanders bill and the Tulsi Gabbard bill, there are commitments to get the US 100% off fossil fuels by 2035, or 2050 in the case of the Sanders bill, and 80% renewable energy by 2027. How are we going to get from that to 80% in 9 years without intervening in markets, without reclaiming control over the sector? And it's a global phenomenon as well. This is world energy consumption. Those top three shows the growth of solar, wind, and other renewables. The rest, it's fossil all the way down, and nuclear is largely staying where it is. So if we've got all of this fossil fuels coming into the global system because of uncontrolled extractionism, no focus on energy conservation, no control of our communities, then this is what makes the struggle for energy a civilizational emergency. So with that, we're going to get some responses from regarding the paper, but also general points about some of the cases of just transition and what it means and where the debates are. And so I want to ask, if I can, Donald LaFleur, the Secretary-Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress, to talk about what's been going on in Canada and maybe what he thought about the paper as well, if he's had a chance to look at it. Thanks.
Samantha Smith of the ITUC came to Canada in June of 2017. We met with 3 ministries, the Prime Minister's office. Tara Peel was there, who's our Health and Safety Environment rep. Joel Duff, Brother Joel, who's the Assistant to the President, was there. That was leading up to, of course, the meeting in Bonn. Catherine Abreu of the Climate Action Network, and with discussion with the labour movement in Canada, decided to make just transition a priority for Bonn, which was very helpful. So the first week in Bonn, we had a Canadian delegation, CLC, I spoke about Tara, Unifor, Sari's here, she was there as well, NUPCHI, OPSU, the Alberta Federation of Labour, the Quebec Federation of Labour, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, Trades, COPE. So I think we had the biggest labour delegation in Bonn. And you know, we were putting pressure, but McKenna wasn't there yet. She arrived the second week. The first briefing meeting she had with Canadians, we had set it up so Brother Gil McGowan of the Alberta Federation of Labour would, one, put her on notice that Alberta, the NDP government, had put in place money and a just transition plan that they had worked out with the Alberta Federation of Labour in place the week before. But not only that, even though the employers in Alberta were given until 2030 to put this into place, layoff notices were going to be given to workers starting that Friday. So in reaction to that, McKenna basically said, okay, we'll meet with you. But when we met with her the next day, she basically brushed us off, as she had been doing for a couple of years now. So we decided to change our plan. We had a press conference that I was participating in with the Climate Action Network, Samantha Smith of the ITUC, the Pembina Institute, the Indigenous Climate Action, and we just completely changed the presentation I was going to make, and we went after the Liberals, as did Brother Hassan Youssef back here in Canada. The media picked up on that, and you know, in my 40-some years of activism, I've never seen a government ministry flipped like 180 degrees within a 24-hour period, but that's what happened. She ended up announcing the task force, and we all saw what's happened there. So you've got the terms of reference in front of you. I'm just going to go through that very quickly here. So, looking at the paper itself, I like to see at the top, you can see, we're talking not just about workers, but about communities. And that is repeated throughout the document. When you look at the first part about just transition, the second paragraph talks about workers and communities. That paragraph ends by saying across society. Again, communities in the next paragraph. And under purpose, what ultimately we're going to be doing is preparing a government or a report for the Environment and Climate Ministry by the end of this year is the plan. The mandate, if you look at the mandate on page 2, at the top of page 2, again, we're talking about workers and communities directly affected. Twice in that part, we talk about communities again when we talk about based on this engagement, which is very important. So talking in the context of that, when I did a presentation on the phone there, I omitted to talk about, and I've looked at the documents that were presented by different departments at the first meeting of the Just Transition, and I just wanted to make it clear, when we talk about communities, we're talking about as well our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So the paper, the presentation that was made at this first meeting, I want to draw your attention to the Just Transition, the Canadian and international context. The agreement also identifies the need to respect, promote, and consider the rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, human rights, and gender equality when taking climate action. Under environment, and this is federal and provincial overview now, Environment and Climate Change Canada. The ECCC is the lead federal department for a wide range of environmental issues, undertaking various actions, including the implementation of Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, engaging with strategic partners, including provinces, territories, and Indigenous peoples. The task force, when you look at the paper, talks about a secretariat as well, and we can see that in the secretariat is the Frédéric Beauregard-Tellier of the Indigenous and External Relations Division. And the ESD Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, also talks to skills training for Indigenous people. So these are programs that were put in place but that were brought in to the task force discussions, and I wanted to apologize for not mentioning that more when we had our discussion on the phone. Just to end, as far as the task force is concerned, on page 3, you can see who is going to be on the task force. It's going to be 9 activists or people. A majority is Labour. Brother Hassan Youssef will be co-presiding this. Tara Peel, the sister I spoke about earlier from the Canadian Labour Congress. Gil McGowan for the Alberta Federation of Labour. United Steelworkers, Unifor, and IBEW are also represented on this task force. So the timing is we're looking at a period of 9 months, and we're hoping to have a final report at that time. Now, on the paper, I think it's great. I've been talking about renewable energy in public hands for a long time as well. If I was to say an improvement that, and I'm not sure if there can be additions or whatever, but if we could talk about what I just talked about, the examples that you put up there, and I believe Scotland, New Zealand have now put task force or commissions together as well. Might be some good examples to show that we're, even though we're not moving fast enough, there are good examples out there. So we're hoping that this will be a good example for the world, including all future transitions, such as job loss due to tech change, as I spoke about when I first started speaking. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks, Anand, for that comprehensive report. And
maybe you have to turn off.
This one's off.
talk about other things because I understand the next days in upstate everyone's not gonna be attend this meeting, so I gonna use some minutes to talk about a little about what Touka is doing about this just transition and environmental and energy democracy. I start from there. We follow the TUED, and we are reached by the TUED discussion so many years, like 6-7 years since for myself since Cancun Cop, and this influenced a lot in the policy in Touka. So we bring some of the ideas and practical process. We have like our proposition about development, and we released in 2014. Is an important document for us. So we incorporate some of the TUED discussions in the whole process of discussions in the South American, Latin American with our affiliates. So that's in somehow evaluating to process, I can say, who are leading a little bit of change of focus in our environmental group, in the Touka's environmental group, because we are focused only in the climate change process, and we follow the failure COP process, and this is very disappointed. And we now try to open the focus in the region to the energy democracy. And these are really good for us, because we put in the table some of important subjects who are matter for the region, and we somehow try to work with another not so disappointed process, so this COP, and that's lead us to we are preparing the third conference, the third conference of environmental and labor and energy democracy. We gonna hold this conference in all you is invited. We really need the support and the help of anyone in this room. We're gonna hold this conference in next October, the early October, probably in Costa Rica. So we just do this first preparing meeting in Buenos Aires like 3 weeks ago, and we put the basis from this third conference. So this document is gonna be a very important issue for us. We want to translate it to Spanish. We can collaborate with that, because like Joshua said, this is the best report about just transition I ever read, and it's gonna be very important for us, because we try to leave the denial position of just transition, what the ITUC is saying about just transition. We passed, I don't know, 4 or 5 years in the South America and Latin America. We just say no for this perspective in this scheme, who put together governments, enterprises, the private sector, and trade unions. For us, it's very clear, and this document say that is impossible for us, because we very honestly don't trust the companies, and in a lot of cases in Latin America we don't trust or recognizing the government. For example, Brazil, it's impossible to sit together with the cool government of Temer or the pretty anti-union governments like the Argentina one from Macri. So this scheme, the proposition of social dialogue, just don't work. But we have to admit we not be able to put something, other ways to force the just transition in the table. In the region, we just say no from the Just Transition Center. We just say no to ITUC, but we really need to have a actual proposition. So that's why we're trying to do in this conference, this October 1 process. And we have very good clues and a pathway starting from this document. This is the most important thing I have to say about this working paper. We can start from here to formulate South, or I don't know if I can say a South perspective, because I understand the Asia Pacific is very different, the African is very different, but we want to try to put in the table some Latin America perspective, some consensus about that, and open a dialogue with brothers and sisters from the global South, and try to influence the global position about the just transition process. That's important for us because in the international level, in the regional level, we have the support, and we have the support of important organizations who is a very good alliance for the Touka. Friends of the Earth, the Via Campesina. I think because the just transition concept is in the preambles of the Paris Agreement, came from the discussion of the just transition concept. And in the first moment, in the discussion with Friends of the Earth, is an important addition from the trade union's perspective. They brings, for example, this idea of community. We have to involve the community in the whole work and process. So we want to do this conference, the regional conference, with a lot of support of the environmental movements, with Friend of the Earth, the Campesino movement with Via Campesina, women's movement with the women's, how you say, Women's March, World March, who's a very good alliance with us in the region, and well, other movements in South America and Latin America. And we try to do, and we really want the support, like I said before, of the brothers and sisters from TUED. About this document, like I said before, and endorsing what Joshua said, this is a very, very good document, including for our perspective. It's very useful for international trade union, but it's very useful from the Touka discussion among our affiliated. The document touch in several important topics, I have to say that. And like I said before, we want this in Spanish to just spread the document among our affiliates. I can point to problems in the document, because one, maybe I understand wrong, because it's a point with Shawn said before, because in my first reading I saw the critical from the social dialogue, but I didn't understand the first time is a critical for the whole scheme of social dialogue. I was thinking it's very localized to the social dialogue in just transition, and we have a crisis in social dialogue at the concept. It's not when we apply to just transition. We have problems in social dialogue, in social security, in all over. So maybe I understand wrong in the first place, because that's the idea I want to reinforce. We have a problem with social dialogue, period. We have in the same time we have this conference. It's gonna in Geneva is holding the I don't know, 9 international conference. The next year is the 100, no? And we're gonna see this. The employers want to recognize the right of strike. This is you can imagine this is like dead for trade unions. If you don't, it's impossible to do a strike. We not have pressure to do. So it's important to recognize in this paper the failure of the social dialogue at whole. And the second thing, I don't fully understand the concept of social power, because that's the next step we have to have, because, well, social dialogue's not working. So what do we do? What we say in Victor and our leaderships in Touka are saying when they ask about this, we say we have to do mobilization. We have to behave ourselves like trade unions, because we, from this, I don't know, 5-10 years, the ITUC is behaving like NGO. Well, we have good arguments, we have good people inside of the COP process or the ILO process, and we're gonna convince the employers, the governments. We have well, we want to convince that we have a point. And if we saw this in the historical perspective, I don't know, this is not working. Actually, it's not working. We can have the arguments, but we need people on the street to force the governments and private sector to move in our direction. So I understand the social power is mobilization, but it's better if it's gonna be more clear. I don't know, maybe I don't understand completely, but that's what I mean. The solution, we are actually now thinking about the solution, thinking what we put in the social dialogue not working, what you put in this scenario. But and the answer for me is mobilization. We have to get strikes about just transition, and that's why we are here. That's why we put together this document and so on. So that's my two only points, but the document is amazing. It's a very good job, guys, and we well, I rest my case.
Thank you, Daniel, for those comments. And it's what we meant by broadening the debate. That means criticisms as well. We want, we embrace those criticisms in order to strengthen our position. I won't personally respond to that now, but maybe later in the day we can. Sam Mason from the Public and Commercial Services Union, fourth largest union, I believe, in the UK. Been doing some great work on just transition and energy democracy, and also part of the process of reclaiming power, the power sector, to public control. Sam.
Okay, thank you, Shawn, and thank you everybody here for this invitation to speak. So I'd like to say particularly thank you to John and Shawn for this paper, because I think it's really excellent and it gives a really good and strong critique of the whole just transition debate, and particularly around social dialogue, and I think we really appreciate that. As Shawn had already flagged up in his presentation, PCS, Public and Commercial Services Trade Union, we produced this report last year on just transition and energy democracy, and one of the things that we talk about there is the need for a transformational transition, not just a just transition and a transition based alone on social protections, that it has to be a transition that addresses the fundamental inequalities that's inherent in the capitalist system, because we don't just want green growth and green jobs, which is very much, I think has already been well articulated, is where the debate is at now. I think in terms of the social power that it presents in the paper, and I'm mainly just going to talk to some of the responses in the paper, again, I think that's really important, because I think social dialogue isn't working, because the power, again, has already been highlighted by speakers, is that we have to recognise and be honest about the weakness of the labour movement, of the organised labour movement at the moment. In the UK, we have under 25% in trade union membership. We have very low levels of collective bargaining. As we've seen since the financial crash, we've seen a trickle up in the reduction of workers' wages, terms, conditions, low pay, the rise of precarious work. 1 in 10 workers are now in precarious jobs, 0 hours contracts. We have over 1 million people relying on food banks. We have something like 11% of households that are in fuel poverty in England, and this is the transition that's happened since the financial crisis. So certainly, when the left should have been stronger, as Joshua's pointed out, we've actually been knocked backwards. So we do have to recognise that when it comes to power and sharing a space at the table of negotiation, we're in a very weak position, unfortunately, but that's where we are. I think also it was touched on last September at Trade Union Congress in the UK, there was a historical motion that was passed unanimously by trade unions on climate change and the need for public ownership and democratic control of energy, also around just transition in industrial strategy. But I think whilst that was very good and fundamental in its time, we've got a long way to go in terms of the debate in the UK. Trade unions are very divided, even on what just transition means. It goes from one extreme, if you like, PCS at one end of needing this to be a transformational, a socio-economic and political process, to another as trade unions seeing it as a redundancy policy, and then we should reject all talk of just transition completely, and some believing that we can rely on our current welfare programs to protect workers, which I'm sure the same as most other industrialised nations has obviously seen people generally in communities suffering under cuts to welfare programs. So we're having our first discussion, actually, what just transition means in the TUC, in the trade union movement in the UK in July. Probably just to highlight here, I think, again, it's indicative that actually facilitating that is going to be somebody coming from the corporate world. Not even from the trade union movement, where we've got a host of obviously experienced and trained facilitators who'd be better placed at that table. So I don't hold out much hopes, and I think, again, thanks to TUED, because the debate in the UK is actually really happening through the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy initiative, not through our sort of peak Labour Federation. And they actually seem very unconcerned about that, which is interesting of itself. But I think the other important thing is coming back to the power issue that shows, because of our weakness, we do have to build alliances, and what was referred to earlier around a kind of social movement trade unionism. And I was reflecting on this because I think we do this in our other campaigns. We do this around education. We do this around housing. We don't do it on the environment and climate change. And I'm not sure why. We don't do it in a big way. And I think perhaps one criticism from a UK perspective, that kind of alliances with the environmental and wider climate movement isn't on the ascendancy in the UK. I think it is to a limited extent. I think PCS, not alone, but is one of the few unions that do actually work, try to work across alliances. And we do a lot of work with Friends of the Earth, 350.org, which I think a number of people here will know. But I think it's interesting as well that we've actually got groups now coming to us, to the Coal Action Network, which is fighting against mainly open cast coal mining in the UK, have actually become more interested in just transition and developing campaigns that actually supports workers, and not just they're opposing these schemes, but actually how we can work with the labour movement to put forward our aims as workers and for the working class as well. And I think on coal, because we have got the UK government has trumpeted quite a lot its coal phase-out plan and been a leader on this, and the plan is to phase out coal, but unabated coal by 2025. So unabated, that means where there isn't carbon capture and storage or sequestration. Also, that doesn't mean that's in the power sector, so that doesn't mean in terms of other coal, so like metallurgical coal for steel production, and there's currently already plans underway for deep coal mining off the north coast, 80% of that which will be for export. So whilst we argue for a steel industry in the UK, that's not actually going to be to develop it, and also that's not looking at some of the decarbonisation that needs to happen within the steel sector. But I think the other important thing about the social power approach as well is that for PCS as well, we talk in terms of having a whole economy approach. It's been important for us partly because we're a civil service union, so we're at the heart of government where most of our members are. We don't have members in the energy sector, but we do have members that are working on the policy monitoring and regulatory roles of energy and all these sectors. But we can't just limit it. We don't think just transition is just about limiting it to the energy sector and a sort of like-to-like transfer of jobs and skills, which is really, again, where the debate largely is. And I think that's largely where it is in terms of the social dialogue debate. A lot of it is just stuck in the skills transfer rather than actually looking at, well, what does this new economy look like, this zero-carbon economy look like? Because it was highlighted around militarisation, and the UK government is setting up a whole number of deals and boosting its arms export economy, but also we've got the issues of automation as well to confront. But I think this is part of where we've got some positive hope in terms of the Labour Party and their movement around public ownership and democratic control of energy. They're still not really connecting that up into a wider climate change framework. And I think this is where we need to try and bring across some of these ideas about some of the ideas that they also have for a Labour Party manifesto, but with repealing some of the anti-trade union laws and better rights for workers, how that also needs to be linked into this just transition agenda as part of this whole economy approach, and looking at the sectors where it's not just about, say, we have the discussions now in the car industry that we need electric cars, so we're transition people across into that, but we actually have a discussion about what transport means and public transport and changing actually our whole transport needs. I think one criticism on the paper, I think that there's a point where it says, and I may have misunderstood this, that the transition isn't ideological. I'm slightly misquoting that, appreciate without directly quoting it, but I think climate change is ideological, so we have to address it on ideological terms. And so unless we confront it in these kind of political and socio-economic and environmental justice globally, not just obviously within our own nations and sectors that we're involved in, and look at the impacts across the board, then obviously we're not going to make the rapid transitions that we need to make. I don't think, unfortunately, the urgency of the science doesn't resonate. I think if we talk in the trade union movement in the UK, I think most unions will accept the science that's out there, but actually not the urgency and the things that we actually need to do to start transforming our sectors. I think we also need to build power in the labour movement itself, and it's not just a question of our allies around, because I also, in some of the unions, these discussions are not even happening, and not happening at the lowest levels of membership. When I think we just had PCS conference last week, we had 10 motions on climate change and the environment. That is very rare in any trade union, and that covered a whole range of issues. But that's not happening in other unions. These discussions are not happening. It's not happening at the grassroots and from the bottom up. And I think it's another issue we have to confront, that obviously a lot of this terminology means nothing to most workers, and we need to connect that at local level, which the speaker earlier on, Natasha, I think it was, made reference to, because I think that is very important, because in the day-to-day, just transition, all this terminology means very little when you've obviously got to pay your bills, feed the kids, etc. So that does need to translate, and we have to take that on board, but that's where it comes back into the economic and social transformations that we need, and political transformations around making these issues of justice, not just about the climate change, which obviously does need to be addressed. As it was mentioned about Scotland, just to say a few things, Scotland is actually leading the way within the UK context on a lot of this discussion. There is the Just Transition Partnership in Scotland, which is with trade unions and environmental groups. Who've done a lot of good work. The Scottish Government has announced Just Transition Commission. Now we've got to see how that plays out in terms of worker input into that and trade unions' involvement. One of the motions I just referred to that was passed at our conference last week is to actually have a conference in Scotland of PCS members in relation to the Climate Change Act, which has just gone through in Scotland, and how that's going to impact our members and how they can be involved in a just transition process around that in Scotland. The other thing at PCS that we're calling for, which again was just passed in a motion last week, is a Just Transition Act, and this really builds on the Bernie Sanders bill and sort of Clean Energy Workers Act that was put forward a couple of years ago. Partly as a way of bringing that debate out into a wider sphere, and why we're calling it Just Transition, it's not just about social protections. We want that to be about how we make some of these intersections across all the social justice issues that we need to be doing as part of this. So it's not just ensuring a floor of rights for workers, which we believe is needed, but also making sure it links up with these other discussions that we're having both across the Labour Party on the political terms, and within the Labour movement and other social justice areas as well, so we can have a more transformative politics towards that. So I think there's some reasons to be optimistic. I think somewhere in the paper it mentioned this should be about hope as well, and I think we need to have hope. I'm not given to optimism greatly, but But I think my niece said something to me at the weekend that made me sort of stop and reflect on that a bit, because when I was lamenting that my football team that I support didn't get promotion this season, and let's hope it's going to happen next year and this isn't misplaced optimism, she said we won't win anything with pessimism. So I think she had a good point there. So I'll leave it there.
Before Ananda from Climate Justice Alliance is next, just do a little time check. We're up against the time for this session, but we did start late, so I'm urging us to be a bit patient. We have lunch coming soon, in the next 20 minutes or so. But if we can hang in there for the end of the session, that'll be really great. So Ananda, Climate Justice Alliance, welcome, and your comments, please.
Okay, thank you, Shawn, and thank you, Trade Unionists for Energy Democracy, for this excellent paper. And thank you all. You know, if it weren't for, dare I say, the radical leadership of the labor movement that I believe is represented here in the room, I probably wouldn't be here myself. So I am grateful for all the work that you do and for having convened this meeting. In reviewing the paper and coming here, I thought what I would do is really look at the theme of this panel and how do we broaden the debate to provide a radical and inspiring vision of change, and how perhaps this report can be further tailored to do that. And so I applied that filter. And firstly, I'll say I'm a community organizer. When it comes down to it, that's what I do. And to my brother from South Asia, who brought up the important point, I organize in communities that are the global South and the global North. We represent the communities on the front lines of the ecological crises, poor communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, Asian Pacific Islander, indigenous, Latino, Black, and other communities that are not only the first and most hit by the storms and floods and droughts and you know, the other impacts of climate change, but also are on the front lines of the fight against the industries causing that climate change. Whether it's the uranium mines, the coal mines, the coal power plants, the gas pipelines, all the infrastructure that's being built, and even some of the infrastructure that's being built in the name of climate action. So I'll just name that. What's probably more important is that I consider myself a community-led organizer, and I think this speaks to the heart of where we need to align with the labor movement, with the radical labor movement. As a community-led organizer, I seek the leadership of those communities in defining our agenda, and as very different from the mainstream NGO movement that defines the climate movement. Back to the paper. I think there's 3 or 4 areas where I think we can strengthen the discussion and debate here. One is my mother always used to say that if to understand where we need to go, thinking ahead, we have to really have a strong understanding of where we've come from, you know, and what has our movement provided. And this paper provides an excellent, and I learned a lot, really analysis of the neoliberal economic policy agenda and how it has influenced the climate policy agenda internationally. However, what it perhaps needs a bit more examination of is our movement history. To foster the broadest and most transformative vision, we need to look at our own past, not simply the history of the ruling class and their agencies, but more importantly, the thought leadership, the historic thought leadership of our own communities. And as many of you know, Just Transition, at least in what we call Turtle Island, aka North America, originated on the front lines of the fight between jobs and environment, originated in debates around First Nations indigenous land sovereignty and the industries that they were fighting that were extracted from their traditional lands. You know, back in the day, in the Pacific Northwest, it was the forest industry, and I'm really grateful for Brother Donald, you know, alluding to that important history, because that's back in the 80s, you know, fall on the heels of the OCAW and the important work done by Masaki and others down here. The debate really sparked up in the War of the Woods, you know, where multinational forest companies were raping the land, extracting all the resources to create jobs abroad. And indigenous communities found allies, not only amongst environmentalists, but amongst radical trade unionists. And together with members of the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers, the Pulp Paper and Woodworkers of Canada, and many of the other forerunners of the Just Transition movement up there, we kind of actually started to strive for some political alignment. What are the pillars of a just transition, starting with indigenous land sovereignty? Some of that history is so important, it is reflected in why Standing Rock happened. It's reflected in why the Kinder Morgan protest is happening right now in the community I live in, and why pretty much all the indigenous nations, barring 3, between the tar sands and the coast line of where Vancouver is, have lined up against this massive extractive effort. We just learned that Trudeau is planning a buyout, a $5 billion buyout of this pipeline company. And we could talk more about that struggle later. But that's important because to understand the roots of resistance against neoliberal trade agendas, that's where this movement sparked too. It wasn't amongst the NGO world, it was in Chiapas. You know, it was amongst campesino movements, indigenous peoples movements, who were the first ones to bring the warning of what neoliberal trade policies threaten to do to the rest of us up the coast of Turtle Island to many communities in North America. It's also how we define vision, because some of those communities, not modern Eurocentric science. There's a reason we asked the scientists and the faith leaders to march at the back of the climate march during. It's not because we were in denial of science, but because both science, Eurocentric science, and faith have served other agendas, the agendas of the ruling class. They have a few centuries to make up on that before they get to march at the front of the march. It was indigenous leadership, the people who know what is the pathway, not the renewable energy experts. It's the people who have the place-based knowledge that can lead us out of this crisis, who need to lead, and the labor movement needs to support them. The other 2 areas I think that's really critical for this paper to really deepen its examination of is what is systemic change, both deepening and broadening the narrative. To quote one of our own labor leaders, Dave Cole, former president of the CEP, the system is not broken. It was designed this way. It was built to serve the ruling class. So when we think of restructuring, we need to think about that. What is the new economy we need to build? Based on local indigenous knowledge, based on the political power of communities and workers, but really serving ultimately our agenda, not somebody else's agenda. And that is currently a huge problem in the climate movement. And unfortunately, even many of the initiatives spoken about here in this room is falling into the false trap of neoliberal corporate techno fixes that are not going to get us to where we need to go. We need to broaden the narrative of climate action to include all facets of justice, including a deep strategic offensive, like our brother Joshua brought up, against the rise of fascism, militarism, racism, misogyny, and how these forces actually ultimately support the reemergence of neoliberal trade policies and investment strategies. Because it's not simply about decarbonizing our economy. Until we understand that in order to decarbonize our economy, we also need to detoxify our economy, we need to demilitarize our economy, we need to degentrify our economy. We also need to decolonize and democratize our economy. And until those are as important, goal as how many parts per million of carbon we're going to reduce, we're not going to get anywhere. I'll be straight up. Our movement's not about 350, 400 parts per million degrees. It's about the needs of communities, the poorest communities on the planet. And if the labor movement cannot support the leadership of the poor, we don't have a starting point in this game. So there's a lot more to that we can unpack, about the relocalization, redesign, but also rethinking political leadership and our own base building strategy in engaging in this crisis. Around real needs, and that's where the commonality comes in. One piece I will mention, though, there is an important part that we need to look at, and I'm really glad that Shawn and others brought this up in this report, is delineating between false corporate promises, the techno fixes embedded in the neoliberal trade agenda, and community-led solutions. Governor Jerry Brown is inviting the world to the Global Climate Action Summit in September in San Francisco. With the leadership of the new climate heroes, the Richard Bransons, the Michael Bloombergs, the Anand Mahindras, the Tom Steyers, the Elon Musks, the champions the captains of industry who are going to save us. And of course, the NGOs that provide them cover. I'll call it up, straight up. The Climate Action Network, I was on a conference call with them. I said, as long as you're going to support the solutions that Michael Bloomberg and Elon Musk are putting on the table, we're not with you. The line's very clear in the sand. What the Global Climate Action Summit represents, it not only represents these industrialists and their efforts to increase market share and adapt, but it's really about some fairly advanced, Al Gore, the global pollution trading markets. And I know that, you know, the labor movement has been involved in this dialogue. The most recent cap and trade bill in California was a perfect example. We were not on the same side. You know, the labor movement there took the side of the industrialists, the corporate polluters, you know, the climate and disaster capitalists, and abandoned us. You know, that's what's being negotiated, a global pollution trading market, the harmonization of the California cap and trade scheme, China, Canada, and other cap and trade schemes, and efforts to financialize pollution, financialize harm, financialize and make profits, you know, off the impacts on the poor. You know, what is it going to be purpose for? Clean coal, biomass energy, nuclear power, natural gas, bridge fuels, mega hydro. Again, you know, what technologies that are being posited as clean, renewable energy technologies, but that are fundamentally against us. If you want to know what's good for us, don't look to Bill McKibben. Go to your local indigenous community and find out what's going to work for them. Finally, it's about getting back to basics. And I think this is where I think I'd echo a lot of my fellow panelists. I think there needs to be some instruction on how are we organizing political power. I think I believe that hope needs to be organized. You know, hope ultimately, that what I do and where I find my hope is the fact that I'm constantly reminded that the communities that I serve are not just not only represent the latent political power that needs to be organized, they have the thought leadership to guide me and all of us in the right direction. Beyond the false binaries of jobs versus environment, to really understanding how can we create an economy that not only serves the natural ecosystems, but communities and workers first. I think embedded in that is there's a lot of great, there's so many examples. I think Via Campesina was brought up. I think there's pathways of food sovereignty that I think the labor movement has started having meaningful dialogue around, but we need to drill deeper, because really at the end of the day, it's not just about the sectoral shifts. I used to cut my teeth organizing tree planters in a sector where we were the lowest paid workers in the forest industry. We organized around a vision where we could take control of the means of production and share that, you know, with all communities, you know, and at the same time support the indigenous communities and their rights to traditional title of land. I believe that kind of organizing is where we need to really invest in the labor movement, the real leadership of the rank and file, you know, and bring them to California in September. You know, turn up on the streets at the Solidarity to Solution Summit, where we're going to invite hundreds of communities from around the world to really talk about what's the alternative to what Bloomberg, Musk, Branson, and Jerry Brown are presenting. And we invite the labor movement to join us on the streets to take direct action. It's a target-rich environment, the San Francisco Financial District, and it's also a place where we've built power on the streets. You know, let's be strategic. When we take action, let's be strategic and try to shift the frame, because that's where I think we will gain some traction. So September 9th and 10th, the People's Solutions and Solidarity Summit. We invite the labor movement to come and join us, and then we take direct action when the corporate, the disaster capitalists start meeting inside. Thank you.
Thanks, Ananda. Right at the back there, Alicia, I believe.
Going to actually integrate climate change and just transition to their day-to-day work rather than standing apart as these separate special events. I'm wondering, what are some ways folks imagine that actually would work?
For the integration question. Yep. Okay, thanks, Alicia. I'll take one or two more.
Just wanted to say we as the UFCW are very, very happy to be here. Some might wonder about our standing with regard to this particular issue not being in the energy sector, but the ITUC General Secretary, the dead planet means no jobs. I think we have standing on that basis also, although there are merits and all the critiques with regard to biofuels, the future of biofuels, we obviously would have standing with regard to that debate. I want to make a very quick comment. It's not a question, but I want to congratulate you, Shawn, John, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the Murphy Institute for an excellent, excellent paper, which is a terrific reference. But I want to just make a very brief comment about this issue of social dialogue and social action. I totally agree with what has been the critique and the deconstruction of social dialogue, its practice. By the way, when you're showing in the photos with regard to the Treaty of Rome photos of 1957, you could have shown the photo of the Treaty of Versailles 1919 photos of the actual founding of the ILO with regard to the whole concept. There's no question that social dialogue has been manipulated, it's stacked, and that we come to a totally stacked table on it. I do think, however, and this follows up on some of the comments that Danielle was making, that both tactically and strategically as a global trade union movement, and I know the paper does not say reject, we're going to continue to reject social dialogue. But the question of the global labor movement, its position on social dialogue, I think has to be very carefully articulated, nuanced for the future. And let me just say this, there's a certain dialectic in terms of using the mechanisms of social dialogue to expose social dialogue and to get to the points of the paper. I mean, for example, as has already been pointed out by Danielle, at this moment is the ILC in Geneva. That's an instance of social dialogue. It's also an opportunity within the various instances of that conference to expose the contradictions. That's done on the Committee of Applications of Standards all the time. It's being done. And I perfectly understand Daniel's point. We can't sit down at the same table with golpista governments. But let me just point out this detail, Daniel. At least I have been informed by this by the AFL-CIO delegation this morning, that on the list of countries to be examined on the Committee of Applications of Standards includes Brazil on Convention 98 for ostensible violations of that convention. And obviously the whole political context of that will be examined. And Mexico on Convention 87. And what will happen in that committee? Well, Brazil will be brought forward as a government to actually respond to employers and workers. Is that an instance of social dialogue? It is. The ILO considers that an instance of social dialogue. So anyway, I won't belabor the point, but I just wanted to underscore that point, is that we may be able to use the mechanisms of social dialogue to actually expose the contradictions which are so ably articulated in this paper. Thank you.
Brother from India, please.
I'm Chennaya from India, working with agriculture workers and forest workers, fish workers, and also feel energized to take this further. When you see the pragmatic level, lot of challenges leave us. Those communities which has been struggling to protect their own resources as against the corporate sector, which has been grabbing whatever the meager resources that are with the community, which contributes to this kind of process if at all they are supportive. And on the other hand, the organized sector is only 6% in India, is concerned 6% of the organized sector of workers is nowhere near to these realities because they were really in phases of protecting their own work and employment. So the state power is becoming like a broker, is a very bad word to use, to corporate sector. And how are we really bridge these things? And is it demands our own efforts to really put towards the protect those resources should be in the hands of the people which has been protecting the nature in these years, and so that we will be able to touch some of these issues concretely. It really demands a lot of work for us to do really, to take up these things further task.
Excellent point, brother. Can I suggest, if I don't see any more hands at the moment, I have actually one more. Take Simona Fabiani from CGL Italy. I think Simona, you had your hand up? Yes, please, Simona. And then we'll maybe see if the panel wants to respond to the question Alethea raised about integration, but we have to be very succinct. Please, Simona, thank you.
When social dialogue is not good to achieve our objective, what can do trade union, and if we are able to build the mobilization, the fight, the struggle to achieve our objective. And I think this is the problem in this moment, because we are not winning, and we have to organize a struggle and a fight. This morning I hear a lot of comrades from different country or different organization, but also social movement. We have the same objective. I think just transition is not only a transition
to another kind of work in a decarbonized economy, but you have to take together all the issues that this morning we speak about. Social justice, fight against inequality, fight against fascism, racism, water crisis. We have to take all this fight together, as is not easy. I think the point that is important is in this work and to make a common reflection on how we can do, because we are, Samantha say we have to be honest, we have difficulties because we have good theories, but we are a lot of people in the world, but we cannot win. So I think and I hope these days help us to discuss together and find not a solution, because I think it's very difficult, but an inspiration to work together.
Thank you for that, Simona. Maria, did you want to maybe conclude this session? And then we can come quickly back to the front.
And I was thinking of when people are talking about the critique on social dialogue. Here in our union, social dialogue, all the participating partners have their own strategic interests. We view this as just one tool in our toolbox. As a union, engaging with management should be viewed, or social dialogue should be viewed as a tool in our toolbox, and we as trade unions should not surrender our right to strike, our right to mobilize, our right to take action on the streets when we feel it's necessary to put the pressure, the strength in the bargaining table or whatever, because it's still the 101. You will have strength at the table if you have the strength in the street or in the workforce or in the communities.
Thank you for that. Excellent point, Maria. I'm going to take it back to the front, but it will have to be very, very one sentence, two sentences response. Perhaps take up Alethia's question about how do we integrate, and this was raised in other questions, how do we integrate these other issues into climate and a struggle for energy being a strategically crucial area of struggle in the world today. So Daniel, can I start with you? Because
I think respond first question for the sister. I think we have to put this subject in the political importance that it is. For example, we are having support of the German organization here, and German is a good example of how the environmental issues is important political matter in Germany. They can Merkel or another candidate have a position in environmental issues can change the election. We have to do this with the just transition and the future of the earth. So it's a role from everyone in this room, everyone in the trade union movements to raise the importance of the environmental, energy, democracy issues inside of the trade unions. This the only way. And just 1 minute about what Stan said about the social dialogue. I don't have problem with the idea of social dialogues, because social dialogue, the whole idea, what the trade union string brings to the table with the negotiation, people power. That's why we have a problem now, because we renounce for this element, this key element. We go to the table with good ideas, with a good paper. We renounce to gather people, mobilizations. That's the whole problem. That's what you have to change in the future.
Thank you, Daniel. Sam.
Yeah, just come back to the question about integrating climate change day to day. Where a couple of initiatives in PCS. I mean, one thing we've always tried to do is just not talk about what we're against and what we're for, and come up with alternative plans. So three specific areas at the moment in our revenue and customs. So it's our sort of tax offices as well. There's a mass closure program going on at the moment. So we're actually working on looking at the carbon footprint of those closure programs, the impact on workers and communities. Another area is in our aviation and transport sector of the members. They're looking at an integrated transport policy and strategy. So what would that mean as an alternative plan? Obviously addressing climate change issues as well. In our culture sector, so in our museums and galleries, we've worked with other activists and environmental groups and climate groups around the sponsorship of the fossil fuel industries and sponsoring art exhibitions and stuff like this. This is our public sort of institutions saying they're not appropriate partners to be using that as a way of sort of soft power and promoting their own interests. And one thing I forgot to mention in my contribution is that another initiative we have underway is trying to build power from below through workers' alternative plans, and remembering, some of you will be aware of the Lucas Aerospace Corporate Alternative Plan that was formulated 41 years ago when workers in the aerospace industry, mainly working on military contracts, were faced with massive redundancies. They actually drew up a plan looking at socially useful production, so rather producing things to go and kill people, producing stuff that could actually save lives and help people's lives. So we actually have a new project, and that's a grassroots project, so trying to look at bottom-up ways of working with communities and workers as the wealth creators about how they've actually got the solutions and can start building the alternative plans within their own communities and sectors. So that's another way we're trying to integrate this into a sort of industrial negotiating and bargaining framework.
Thank you for that, Sam, and reminding us of the Lucas plan, so important.
Thank you, Shawn. Just 2 points here. Just on the social dialogue, I've got to add, you know, the sister said it's not always a problem. You know, timing is everything, right? If you had talked to me about social dialogue when we had Harper at the helm in Canada, I would have been saying, yeah, I mean, what's the point? May as well talk to the wall. And Trudeau hasn't been perfect. We just heard they're buying a friggin' pipeline, which is mind-boggling. But we've gotten an asbestos ban, improved Canada pension plan, movement on gender, the Just Transition Task Force, and we've still got a lot of work to do. But, you know, I'll add to that, just look at the States. Obama versus Trump. You know, in South America, we've had, you know, great leaders, Chavez comes to mind, Morales, Lula. Timing's everything. And regardless of that reality, it's never enough, and it's not the end-all solution, you know? We need to take action, we need to organize. Just answering the sister's question, you know, union committees, environment committees, we've got an environment committee that brings together potentially 56 unions in Canada, and we talk about the environment all the time. Collective bargaining, if you go to adapting Canadian workplaces, you'll find contractual language from around the world that you can incorporate into your collective agreements, including having environment committees that mirror health and safety committees, so on and so forth. On privatization, I just want to add, OPSU in Ontario has been doing a great job pushing the We Own It campaign, and it's helping us in Ontario push back on the privatization of hydro, and the NDP government is surging in the polls, and they're promising to put hydro back into public hands. I just want to say a couple of things. We're hoping to have a climate change jobs conference in the spring of 2019 in Canada, and we're working on a musical that hopefully will play around the world about the Winnipeg 1919 general strike that will be premiering next year, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you for that, Tanal. Ananda?
Sorry, brother.
I'll try to be brief. I personally don't have a problem with social dialogue. My issue is with who you're having that social dialogue with.
That's right.
Now, if the labor movement wants to keep talking to the bosses and the NGOs that provide them cover, you can keep doing so, but you won't be talking to our movements. If you want to talk to our movements, we have a whole set. You know, we are keen to engage with you, and I think therein lies the opportunity and the possibility. Because one of the problems I see emerging from the social dialogue is what I call issue reductionism, similar to carbon fundamentalism, where you get siloed into dealing with piecemeal solutions that will never really get us there. You know, and that's what happens when you talk to the people ruling the world and the people destroying the world and all the NGOs that provide them cover. I keep saying that, just make note of that. There are NGOs that are set up to provide them cover. The other side of the coin is, if you believe that it is a systemic problem that we need to address, you need to come up with systemic solutions and break out of the sectoral silos. And that can only happen when you immerse yourself on the front lines of the crisis, with those being most impacted. Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent panel. I think the morning sessions have been great. I hope you agree. We're going to reconvene at 1:30. Lunch is right here, so there's no walking around Central Park. Thank you, everybody.